Right, you may have heard during the week a lot of talk about ADHD. What does ADHD stand for?
It stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder.
Wow, thank you very much. This week I've heard Dom talk a lot about it in the news, saying something about the fact there's new evidence to suggest a genetic link to ADHD, and it's not entirely down to environmental factors like how you're brought up. So first of all, let's get a few facts from Stuart. Stuart, what is it?
Okay, well, it's a very broad term for sort of behavioural problems, and that would encompass things like a poor attention span, lack of concentration, difficulty on focusing on things, hyperactivity, particularly in kids and toddlers that seem to be really hyperactive. So it's a kind of umbrella term for all of those behavioural problems.
So does that just kind of apply to so many people, though?
It does, and lots of people think, well, I might have ADHD, and that's why it can be difficult to diagnose, or in some cases quite easy to diagnose and therefore label people with it.
Right.
So it's one of those things where there's not a specific test we can do to say, yes, you've definitely got it. And that's why this study was interesting, and there's been lots of discussion and talk about it, because it suggested that there may be a genetic component to it. Now, it was quite a small study, and I think it's good to throw that into the mix, but there's definitely a lot of other environmental factors, and that means other things that happen in our lives that can be a reason for all of those behavioural issues. And that can be, for example, if you've come from had a really stressful time recently, if you've come from a family that's going through divorce or splitting up. There's loads of reasons why people could have poor attention spans or concentration issues, and a genetic component or some sort of familial element may just be a small part of that jigsaw.
So if you're being shouted at by a parent or a teacher or a colleague or a friend for what could be under the ADHD label, how can you go and find out if you've actually got it?
Definitely talk to your doctor about it, because they'll give you more advice about it. Sometimes you might see a psychologist who's a specialist in behavioural issues, and it's all about really getting more advice about it and support as well, because sometimes those behavioural things can change if your background issues change. So if you're in a less stressful environment, or if you're in another class that can give you a little bit more time and help with your concentration issues. So talk to your teachers, talk to your doctor, and they'll give you lots of help and support.
Okay, thank you, Dr Stuart. Earlier on this evening I spoke to Ollie, who's 19 and was diagnosed with ADHD when he was 13. So I asked Ollie, first of all, what it was like living with the condition.
Well, when I was younger, I was really disruptive. I found it hard to concentrate on a lot of things. Apparently something to do with it is you find it hard to read people's emotions, and you don't really understand what people are feeling, so you can get into a lot of trouble.
And presumably you have no idea of this. You're just going by, you're doing your own business, and then other people are telling you that you should be more considerate and stuff, and you have no clue. Yeah, I knew it was a bit odd. I was acting different to other people, and there'd be occasions where I think, well, this is wrong. Why am I doing this? It doesn't feel good, and I just thought, I didn't know any different at the time. Yeah, it must be really frustrating as well. Yeah, I did get frustrated, and a lot easier as well than I do now. Is this something that you've kind of calmed down with, or is it just now that you're aware that you've got it, so you can live with it more? No, I've changed completely, really. It's something that I now don't deal with on a day-to-day basis, apart from taking the medication, of course. But, I live more or less normally without the knowledge of it. I mean, I just kind of, every now and again, I might get traits come through, but most of the time, there's nothing of it. This week, in the news, they were saying that it might be linked to genetics rather than how you're brought up or your, the surroundings that you've got. Yeah. What do you think about that? Does that ring true? Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I texted on the breakfast show when I heard it, and I definitely agree. I think it's almost sort of being used as an excuse by a lot of people, because when people are trying to get help for their kids, they'll just say that it's bad parenting, and you don't really get any further with it, which is what my parents had for almost 13 years, until I was actually diagnosed, and then things started to get better with medication. But I'd like to see them say that actually it's genetic rather than bad parenting, because that way maybe they'd actually help more people rather than kind of pushing it to the side. What do you think people's perception of ADHD is? How have you found it? So, surprisingly, actually, I found out that quite a lot of people know about it. It's quite widespread, which is surprising.
people are different. Everyone's individual cases, and some people can be violent and aggressive, and some people aren't so much. But I've never had anyone treat me completely different, apart from the fact that they're sometimes maybe a bit more careful around me if I was to be irritable.
So that was Ollie's experience, but it raises kind of the bigger questions about people's perceptions of illnesses and disorders. Dr. Stuart, it can be like, let's say that you've got glandular fever and people just think you're moaning that you've got a bad cold, or ME, and people might just think that you're being tired all the time. With things like ADHD, how can we alter people's perception of what it is and how it affects us?
I think it was really interesting to hear Ollie's point of view, because it reminded me a bit of how we used to treat people with dyslexia, particularly at school, where they had difficulty concentrating and often got labelled as just being stupid and thick and behind. And actually it was because, you know, they were having difficulty with the material that was presented to them and couldn't actually process it in the way that lots of other people can. And once we understood that that was actually going on, that was a process, then, you know, all of those labels quite rightly got thrown in the bin. And with anyone, especially when you're young and you're diagnosed with something, for example, if someone's diagnosed with diabetes, then you get immediately labelled as, oh, you're diabetic, so that means you must be like this. Or if you have depression, that means you must be, you know, a really horrible person to be around and really down all the time. Whereas actually that's one small component of who you are as a person. It doesn't sum you up or define you. And, you know, even, you know, a classic example is someone who has anorexia. And as soon as we say that word, we think of, you know, a sort of 14, 15-year-old girl who's lost a lot of weight. But we know that about 10% of people with anorexia are boys and men. So there's lots of, you know, things that are actually completely out of the box of what we tend to think of in our minds. And I think it's really important to not put people into a box and not label them, because whenever we talk about illnesses or mental health problems, it's one small part of who they are. It's not the whole person, and it doesn't define them as a person. And, you know, actually the person they are is that individual friend or brother or sister or whatever.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Stuart.